Hey everyone, and welcome to the Balanced Bodies Blueprint. I am your host, Vinny Russo.
And I am your co-host, Dr. Eryn Stansfield.
And we're shifting gears from all the conventional fitness narrative you hear on most fitness podcasts, as our main emphasis lies in preventative healthcare, adopting a holistic approach to nutrition, and challenging the traditional views on various fitness topics.
Our mission with this podcast is to provide you with the information you need to achieve optimal health. This is Dr. Eryn. I am doing a solo podcast today on the top doctor-recommended don'ts, especially as it pertains to parents. And just to give some background, last time we talked about some do's, and this all came to light because I'm currently pregnant. So I'm thinking ahead and thinking of all the little pieces of advice that would help parents out there. And it allowed me to go back in time a little bit and kind of educate myself. It's been a while since I myself did any work in pediatrics since medical school. So this was kind of an interesting topic for both of us. Anyway, I will not delay any further, but let's talk about the don'ts. So I want to preface this with saying that in this population is mostly teenagers when I think about top don'ts. And the reason is because according to CDC data, accidents, especially unintentional injuries, are the number one cause of teenage deaths, with a rate of 22 deaths per 100,000 teens in 2022. A big component of that is motor vehicle fatalities, which leads the type of accident usually causing teen deaths. Now, I know it's difficult to prevent that, right? Besides, teaching safe driving and making sure that your teenager is responsible, those sorts of things, and driving in a way that is safe, wearing their seatbelt, that sort of thing. But also, among these unintentional injuries, recent trends show an increasing share due to drug overdoses and poisoning, which made up 31% of accidental teen deaths. Again, I remember back in the day we used to have school assemblies on "It's hot to not," so no drug use, that sort of thing. I think teenagers, especially middle schoolers even, have more access to drugs now than they probably did 20 years ago. And we'll get into this a little bit later, but vaping is a big deal and one way that could cause preventable harm for teenagers. So without delaying too much further, let's get into my top don'ts. And most of these, like I said, will relate to teenagers. So my top one don't that doctors usually don't recommend are ATVs and off-roading vehicles. Now, I know that's very controversial because they're a lot of fun. And I would say that if you choose to ride in these vehicles, that you wear some kind of protective equipment. That can be a helmet, hearing protection, especially for younger kids. But basically, the Consumer Product Safety Commission estimated that in 2022, there were 94,000 injuries associated with off-roading vehicles that were treated in the U.S. Emergency departments. And over a 5-year period, ATVs were involved in 92% of those off-roading vehicles. So these seem like a lot of fun, and I know that a lot of families own them, and especially here where I live in Utah, we're always up in the mountains, and most families have some kind of off-roading vehicle, but you have to be careful, you have to be safe. Make sure you're wearing a helmet if you're going to use these, and don't do dangerous things. Try to be safe with your driving. It's fun to, kind of show off your skills, but really try to be vigilant. These can be very dangerous. The next one is gun safety. This is really controversial. I think if you spoke to most pediatricians, they would just say that having a gun in the house is very dangerous to a child, and they would likely recommend no guns. However, I live in a very right-wing state, and a lot of people do own guns. And so I would say that if you do have a gun, especially at home, and you have children, young children, teenagers at home, that you lock them up, that you educate the children, teenagers, whoever you have in the home about gun safety, about guns, so that they aren't overly curious, so they know about them. And even, if you need to take them shooting, those sorts of things, make sure you're wearing hearing protection. But I would say that most physicians, especially pediatricians, would say don't even own one. And the reason why is because there are so many gun deaths. So in 2021, for example, there were 2,500 gun deaths among children and teens under 18 years old. That represents a 50% increase from 1,700 deaths in 2019. So just over a couple of years, we've had a 50% increase. The gun death rate for children and teens rose from 2.4 per 100,000 in 2019 to 3.5 per 100,000 in 2021, with a 46% increase. And just think about this statistic. There were approximately 7 children per day dying from firearms in 2022. So that is a lot of kids to be losing. And most of these are going to be accidental deaths, so they're not even intentional deaths. And sometimes they are, and I think that both are tragic. So I would be very, very careful if you choose to have a gun in the home, to make sure that there's appropriate safety there and safety education. The third one, again, very controversial, and I would recommend this across the board. I did an internship in surgery and saw so many deaths from motorcycles. No motorcycles. I think they're very dangerous. And even if you are the perfect motorcycle handler, other cars and vehicles don't see you on the road. So, for example, in 2022, there were 6,000 total motorcyclist deaths across all age groups. This was the highest number ever recorded, and a 23% increase since 2019. Motorcycle deaths accounted for 15% of all motor vehicle crash deaths in 2022. While not specific to teenagers, 27% of fatality injured motorcyclists in 2022 were younger than 30 years old. I think especially for teenagers, that motorcycles can be super dangerous, even for adults. This is one thing that I remember, again, when I was a surgery intern and working on trauma units, that I saw a lot of accidents with, a lot of injuries, deaths. And I remember talking to a senior resident at the time and them telling me, if you love somebody, tell them never to own a motorcycle. Very dangerous. All right. The next one applies a little bit more to children than teenagers. This is melatonin supplements. So melatonin supplements were a big deal, especially giving little kids gummies that they could chew and, help them fall asleep. However, recently we've noticed, especially in the ER, more trends of kids being admitted because of overdosing on these melatonin supplements, especially the gummies because they're sweet. During 2019 to 2022, there were an estimated 10,000 emergency department visits for unsupervised melatonin ingestion by infants and children aged 5 years and younger in the United States. The number of emergency visits for pediatric melatonin ingestion increased by 420% between 2009 and 2020. And I think that's just because of the popularity of these supplements, vitamins and in social media, and more parents listening to that and giving their kids supplements likely. About 52% of these ER visits involved children between 3 and 5 years old. Gummy formulations were involved in 47% of the documented cases, where the dosage form was specified. So sometimes it's unspecified in the emergency records. But basically, why do we want to not give our kids this? Because a lot of gummies don't actually have regulated doses of melatonin in the gummy, and then even a small amount can cause issues such as sleepiness, nausea, vomiting, stomach pain, headache, difficulty breathing, hyperthermia, slurred speech. And I will say that in extreme cases, a lot of these ER visits involve seizures, loss of consciousness, and respiratory depression. So kids like not breathing. So it can be very dangerous, and I would be very careful and likely just avoid for your kids. So the last one I'm going to talk about is no vaping. Vaping is very popular, I know. In 2023, 7% of the U.S. middle school and high school students, about 2.1 million, used e-cigarettes. There was actually a decline, and I think that's because of the efforts of the federal government to kind of impose fines on these big e-cigarette makers. But there was a decline in e-cigarette use among high school students from 14% in 2022 to 10% in 2023. So I think we're making some improvement there. But of that 7% that I said that use e-cigarettes, it includes 4.6% of middle school students. So more than half are middle school students. So very young kids. And the appeal is the flavored e-cigarettes. But the problem is, one, I want to emphasize, we don't know the long-term effects. But the short-term effects are obviously it can affect the lungs. Sometimes it can cause irreversible lung injury. If they do contain nicotine, which a lot of e-cigarettes do contain nicotine, it's highly addictive, obviously, for youth and young adults, and it can cause brain development issues. Nicotine can harm their brain development in adolescents and young adults up to age 25. It can affect their attention, their learning, their mood, and their impulse control. And obviously, it can expose them to harmful chemicals. E-cigarette aerosols contain cancer-causing chemicals, heavy metals like nickel, tin, and lead, which I think is funny because there's a bunch of social media people saying that there's heavy metals in tampons, and a lot of times we're not preventing like the most obvious exposures where you might be putting heavy metals in your mouth, like smoking and vaping. There's ultrafine particles that can be inhaled deep into the lungs. There's volatile organic compounds, and some of the flavorings are linked to serious lung injury because they have a compound called diacetyl. And there is a potential for seizures, and there's mental health impacts, especially if there's nicotine, which can actually cause more anxiety. So I would say no vaping. These, again, are just a summary of quick preventable things that parents should know about, that should not allow their teenagers/children to be involved in. And if you are going to be involved in some of, the off-roading vehicles and the gun use, then make sure that you're properly educated, that those around you are educated, that your kids are educated about it, and make sure they're wearing the right personal protective equipment, whether that be helmets, hearing protection. Make sure you're keeping them very, very safe. And that is all.
So on behalf of Balanced Bodies, we just want to say thank you for joining us on this episode of the Balanced Bodies Blueprint.
We are committed to bringing valuable content. And if you enjoyed today's episode, we'd greatly appreciate it if you can take a moment and like it and leave a 5-star review.
On Apple, just go to the show, scroll down to the bottom and rate it there. If you're on Spotify, go to the show's page, click the 3 dots, and you can rate it there as well.
And if you believe in the power of knowledge, share this episode on your social media to try and get the information out there to as many people as possible.
And as you navigate your own path towards better health, remember that Balanced Bodies is forever in your corner. See you all next week.
The podcast content may include discussions of medical topics and health-related information. However, the information provided should not be considered exhaustive or complete, and it should not be relied upon as a substitute for professional medical advice or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified healthcare providers with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or treatment.